The kind of morning that changes a life rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with thunder or ceremony. It arrives like any other Tuesday. With weak sunlight pressing through smudged diner windows and the smell of bacon, grease hanging in the warm air of the Magnolia Cup, a small breakfast diner on the corner of Elmwood and 5th Street in Charleston, South Carolina, Jessica Carter had been working the morning shift at the Magnolia Cup for 3 years. She was 26 years old, 5'4". With dark brown hair she kept in a braid when she worked and loose curls when she did not. She had the kind of smile that arrived slowly but stayed a long time. The kind that made strangers feel like they had been recognized. She wore white sneakers that were always clean, no matter how long the shift ran. And she had a way of carrying 4 plates at once without spilling a single drop that her coworker, Brenda, called a gift from God. Jessica did not think of herself as remarkable. She thought of herself as practical. She paid her rent on time. She sent money to her mother Donna every month without being asked. She studied hospitality management at night through an online program she paid for herself, $20 at a time. She did not talk much about her dreams, not because she did not have them, but because she had learned early that dreams talked. About too loudly had a way of embarrassing you, Colton. Reeves walked into the Magnolia Cup on a Thursday morning in early April and sat at table 7 without looking up from his phone. He was the kind of man who filled a room without trying. Tall, wide-shouldered, dark suit that cost more than 3 months of Jessica's rent. He had thick, dark hair beginning to silver at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been clenched since birth. He did not look around when he sat down. He did not make eye contact with the hostess. He ordered black coffee without looking up from the phone screen when Jessica approached, and she thought, briefly, that this was a man who had forgotten how to be in a room with other human beings. She brought the coffee, set it down quietly, walked away. He came back the next Thursday, and the one after that, on the 4th Thursday. He looked up. Jessica was refilling sugar dispensers at the counter when she felt him watching her. She turned, met his eyes directly, and said with calm pleasantness, "Is the coffee okay?" He said, "It is the best coffee I have had in 2 years." She said, "I will tell the cook." He said, "What is your name?" She told him. He said, "I am Colton." She already knew. Charleston was not a city where you could own 3 hotels and a commercial tower without people knowing your face. But she did not say that. She nodded politely and went back to the sugar dispensers. He left a tip that was larger than her hourly wage. She folded it, tucked it into the shared tip jar, and did not think about it again until he came back the following Thursday and left another one. The 5th Thursday he asked if she would have coffee with him somewhere that was not where she worked. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression her friend Brenda later described as a woman doing math in her head. Then she said she got off at 2 and she preferred the coffee shop on Pryor Street because they did not burn the espresso. That was how it began. What followed over the next 4 months was not a fairy tale. It was something quieter and more complicated than that. Colton was not a man who expressed himself easily. He had built a wall so thick around the inside of himself that he sometimes seemed to forget the wall was there and simply presented the wall to the world as if it were his face. He did not talk about his feelings. He talked about plans, about structure, about what needed to happen next. He was generous with money and careful with words, and Jessica understood very early that getting to know Colton Reeves would require patience of the kind that could not be faked. She was patient, not because she was weak or without standards. She was patient because she had grown up watching her mother Donna work 12-hour shifts at a fabric table and still find the energy to sit with Jessica at night and ask her what she had learned that day. Jessica knew what it looked like when a person carried something heavy and kept walking anyway. She recognized it in Colton before he recognized it in himself. He told her about his father one evening on a bench by the harbor. His father had left when Colton was 9. No drama, no fight, just an empty closet one morning and a note that said he needed to find himself. Colton had been finding ways to not need anyone ever since. He said this without self-pity, just as a fact, the way you report weather. Jessica listened without performing sympathy. And that stillness was what undid him. He said, "You do not look at me the way other people do." She said, "How do other people look at you?" He said, "Like they are calculating something." She said, "I am terrible at math." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh completely. Not the polite version he used in meetings, but the real one. Surprised out of him, 3 months later, he asked her to marry him in a small ceremony with only Frank Holloway and Brenda Cole as witnesses. His mother, Patricia, was not there. Patricia had not been invited, a decision Colton made quietly and without explanation. Jessica noticed but did not ask. She was beginning to understand that Patricia Reeves was a subject that required careful navigation. They moved into Colton's penthouse apartment in downtown Charleston. Jessica kept her online classes and her mornings at the Magnolia, cut for 2 more months because she did not want to stop being herself the moment she became his wife. He respected that, or seemed to. He did not press her to stop working. He did not make her feel small for wanting to keep going. When she told him she was pregnant 6 months into their marriage, he stood in the kitchen of the penthouse for a full 10 seconds without speaking. Then he crossed to where she was standing and held her face in both hands and said, "This is real." She said, "Very real," he said. "Good," and his voice broke slightly on the word, and she understood then that he wanted this more than he had been willing to admit to himself. Patricia Reeves arrived, unannounced one. Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Jessica's pregnancy was confirmed. She sat in the living room in a cream blazer with her ankles crossed and her eyes moving slowly around the apartment the way a real estate appraiser moves through a property. She congratulated Jessica with a smile that did not reach the middle of her face, let alone her eyes. She said Jessica looked tired. She said pregnancy agreed with some women more than others. She said she hoped Jessica was not overdoing it. What with the work schedule? Jessica was polite. She offered tea. She answered questions. She did not let herself be rattled, at least not visibly. After Patricia left, Colton said nothing. He stood by the window looking out at the city, and Jessica watched the muscles in his jaw move. She said, "She does not like me," he said. "She does not like anyone who she cannot control." Jessica thought that was a fair assessment. She did not know yet that Patricia's visit had been reconnaissance. She did not know that Patricia had already made a phone call that morning before arriving. She did not know that a plan, quiet and precise and cruel, had already been set into motion before Jessica had even poured the tea. The next 2 months were steady and ordinary, in the way that months before a disaster often are. Jessica's belly grew. Colton came to every appointment he could, sitting in the waiting room with his phone face down in his lap. A gesture so small and so deliberate that the nurse noticed and commented on it. Jessica began designing a nursery. Colton began leaving the office earlier. Something between them had settled into a warmth that neither of them spoke about directly, because speaking about it felt like the kind of thing that could cause it to dissolve. Patricia came to dinner one evening at the penthouse. She brought wine and a gift bag and a folder, though the folder did not come out until after dinner, until after Colton had poured a second glass and Jessica had gone to rest her feet. Jessica was in the hallway when she heard Patricia's voice drop to that particular register, quiet and serious and loaded with grief, the voice of a person delivering terrible news. They wished they did not have to deliver. She stopped walking. She could not hear every word, but she heard enough. She heard the word photographs. She heard the phrase, "I did not want to believe it either." She heard Colton's voice go silent in a way that silence does not usually go. She stepped into the living room doorway. Patricia was holding a small envelope. Colton was holding a photograph. His face had gone the color of the white wall behind him. Jessica said, "What is that?" Colton looked at her. The look on his face was not one she had seen before. It was not anger yet. It was the moment before anger. The moment when something that was solid is still falling and has not hit the ground. He said, "Who is he?" She said, "Who is who?" "Colton, what is happening?" He held up the photograph. A man she did not recognize, dark jacket, standing near a car outside a building she did not immediately place. And then she did place it. It was the office building 2 blocks from the clinic where she had her prenatal appointments. She had walked past it a dozen times. She said, "I have never seen that man in my life," Patricia said softly. sadly, Jessica. Jessica said, I am telling you I have never seen that man. Colton set the photograph down on the table. He opened the folder. Inside were more photographs and a typed document that looked like a report. He read it with his eyes moving quickly, too quickly. The way a person reads something they are trying to confirm rather than understand. He looked up. He said the words in a voice so flat and so cold, it was like the room temperature dropped. You traitor. That baby is not mine and never will be. The silence that came after those words was total. Patricia lowered her eyes to her lap with the performance of a woman too sorrowful to watch. Jessica stood completely still in the doorway of her own home, with one hand resting on her stomach. Then, she said, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, You are wrong. He pointed at the folder. He pointed at the photographs. He said he had proof. He said he did not want to hear her explanation. He said things that built on each other the way terrible things do when a person has decided to believe something, and is looking for a wall to build rather than a door to open. Jessica looked at him for a long time. She looked at the man she had married, the man who had laughed by the harbor, the man who had held her face in both hands and said, Good, with a voice that broke. Then she looked at Patricia. Patricia looked back at her with something small and satisfied moving behind the grief performance in her eyes. Jessica understood in that moment, completely and with a clarity that felt like cold water, exactly what had happened. She understood who had made this. She understood that arguing tonight in this room, with a man this far inside his own closed door, was not a battle she could win. She went to the bedroom. She took the bag she kept ready because her mother had taught her never to be caught without a plan. She put on her shoes. She walked back through the living room without looking at Patricia and stopped in front of Colton. She said, When you come back to yourself, remember that I told you the truth tonight. She left. Outside, the Charleston evening was warm and the street lights were coming on one by one. Jessica Carter stood on the sidewalk in front of the building where she had tried to build a life and breathed in slowly. Then she took her phone out and called Brenda. Brenda did not ask questions. She said, I am coming. Do not move. Jessica sat down on the low concrete wall near the entrance and waited. One hand flat on her stomach, steady the way her mother had taught her to be when the world tried to knock her down. She was not broken. She was furious and heartbroken and completely alone, and she was going to be fine anyway because she did not have any other choice, and because inside her was a life that had not asked for any of this and deserved a mother who stayed standing. She stayed standing. Brenda Cole drove a 10-year-old green Honda that had a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat that leaned slightly to the right, and it was the most beautiful car Jessica Carter had ever sat in. She climbed in that night with her bag on her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and she did not cry until they crossed the bridge leaving downtown Charleston. And then she cried the way a person cries when they have been holding something so tightly for so long that releasing it feels almost violent. Brenda did not say anything. She turned the radio down to nearly nothing and kept both hands on the wheel and let Jessica have every second of it without interruption or advice or the particular cruelty of someone trying to comfort you before you are finished grieving. When the crying stopped, Brenda said, My couch is yours for as long as you need. Jessica wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, I am not staying in Charleston. Brenda looked at her sideways. Jessica said, I cannot raise this baby in the same city where his father decided I was disposable. I cannot do that to myself, and I cannot do that to him. Brenda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Where? Jessica said, Savannah. She had an aunt in Savannah, Georgia. Aunt Ruthie, her mother, Donna's older sister, who had a narrow 2-bedroom house on a street lined with magnolia trees and who had been asking Jessica to visit for 3 years. Jessica had never gone because there was always a shift to cover, a class to finish, a reason to stay exactly where she was. Now every reason to stay had been removed in a single evening by a man holding a folder of lies and a woman who had planted them there. She called her mother, Donna, from Brenda's apartment that night. Donna answered on the second ring, the way mothers answer when they have been waiting without knowing what they were waiting for. Jessica told her everything. Donna was quiet for a long time in the way that quiet people get quieter when they are most upset. Then she said, "You come to me first." Then Savannah, "You do not go anywhere alone." Jessica spent 4 days with her mother in the small apartment in North Charleston where she had grown up. Donna fed her, sat with her in the evenings, and did not once say she had warned her or that she had known or any of the things a lesser woman might have said. She said, "You are going to be the best mother that child has ever seen." And she said it like a statement of scientific fact. On the 5th day, Jessica drove to Savannah with 2 bags, her laptop, her unfinished hospitality management coursework, and the particular determination of a woman who has been told she is nothing and has decided privately and completely to prove the opposite. And Ruthie opened the door in a bathrobe and reading, glasses pushed up on her forehead, and pulled Jessica into a hug that lasted a full minute without loosening. She showed Jessica the second bedroom, which had a window that looked out onto the magnolia tree in the yard, and she said, "This is yours. Take what you need and leave what you do not. No schedule here." The pregnancy continued without complication. Jessica found a clinic 2 miles from Ruthie's house and a bus route that took her directly there. She went to every appointment alone because that was what was available to her, and she sat in the waiting room with the other women and filled out paperwork and answered the nurse's questions and did not allow herself to linger on the image of sitting in that chair beside someone who loved her. She was someone who loved herself. That would have to be enough, and most days it was. She found a part-time job at a small event planning company called Coastal Gatherings, answering phones and organizing vendor files. The owner was a woman named Sandra Pitts, 50 years old, practical and fair, who hired Jessica after a 15-minute interview and said, "You are overqualified for this, but you clearly need steady hours, right? Now, so let us not make it complicated." Jessica appreciated the directness more than she could express. Oliver Reeves Carter was born on a Wednesday morning in October at Memorial Health in Savannah. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Dark hair, which arrived in the world already looking like it had been swept to the side by a small, invisible hand. He cried with tremendous authority for a baby who had been alive for 4 minutes. Aunt Ruthie was in the waiting room. She had knitted a yellow blanket during the labor, the whole thing, start to finish, which said something about how long the labor was, and also about Aunt Ruthie. When the nurse placed Oliver in Jessica's arms, Jessica looked at his face and felt something rearrange itself inside her chest, something structural and permanent. She said very quietly, "Hello, Oliver. I have been waiting for you." He opened his eyes briefly, unfocused and dark, and then closed them again with the complete trust of a person who has decided the world is safe. She held him and decided that, as long as she was alive, for him it would be. She put her own last name on the birth certificate. Carter, the space for the father's name she left empty, not in anger, but in accuracy. He had not been there. The document would reflect what was true. The months that followed were the hardest of Jessica's life, and also, in a strange way that she would not be able to explain until years later, some of the most clarifying. Every morning was early, and every evening was long, and there were nights when Oliver would not sleep, and she would sit in the rocking chair Aunt Ruthie had placed in the second bedroom and hold him in the dark and feel the full weight of doing this without a partner and breathe through it, just breathe. Because panic was a luxury she could not afford. But she also watched Oliver figure out how to smile, a process that took about 6 weeks and resulted in a grin so large it seemed to take up more space than his whole face had available. She watched him discover his own hands with the astonishment of a philosopher encountering a new concept. She watched him find the courage to roll over, which he celebrated by immediately rolling back and then looking at her as if to confirm that yes, what had just happened was indeed extraordinary. She finished her hospitality management certification when Oliver was 7 months old. She studied during nap times and late at night, and on Saturday mornings while Aunt Ruthie sang to Oliver in the kitchen. The certificate arrived in a plain envelope, and she set it on the counter and looked at it for a moment, and then said, out loud, to no one in particular, "There. She approached Sandra Pitts the following week and proposed expanding her role. She had written a 2-page plan outlining how Coastal Gatherings could add a small-scale catering coordination service to its existing event offerings. Tapping into a gap in the mid-range wedding market that Jessica had identified through 6 months of quiet observation, Sandra read it, asked 3 questions, and said, "Start Monday." The catering coordination arm of Coastal Gatherings grew steadily. Jessica had a talent for it that went beyond organization. She understood what people actually wanted when they said they wanted something, and she was good at translating the abstract. Longing behind a bride's vague request for something warm and personal, into a menu and an atmosphere that made people feel exactly that. Word traveled. Bookings increased. Sandra gave her a raise and a title, and then another. Raised 6 months after that, Oliver turned 1 at a party in Aunt Ruthie's backyard. With yellow balloons and the yellow blankets spread on the grass, and Donna down from Charleston with a cake she had baked. Herself that was slightly tilted but tasted extraordinary. He sat in the middle of it all in a patch of afternoon sun and looked around at the women who loved him with the satisfied expression of a person who has correctly assessed that his situation is good. Jessica took a photograph and did not send it to anyone. She kept it for herself. Back in Charleston, Colton Reeves was doing what Colton Reeves always did when his interior life became unbearable. He worked. He expanded. He negotiated a partnership with a hotel group in Atlanta and broke ground on a new property in Greenville and restructured his executive team and arrived at the office before anyone else and left after everyone had gone. He was productive in the way that a person is productive when productivity is the only available anesthetic. His mother Patricia visited the penthouse regularly. She redecorated the nursery into a home office without being asked. She brought women to dinners that she organized in his apartment, using his kitchen and his calendar. She said things like, "You are healing so well." Colton, with a tenderness that Colton accepted because accepting it was easier than examining it. Frank Holloway, Colton's lawyer and the closest thing he had to a genuine friend, watched all of this from a careful distance. Frank had been at the small wedding. He had liked Jessica, he had thought. Privately, and with the instinct of a man who had seen enough human nature in legal proceedings to recognize it on sight, that she was one of the realest people he had encountered in Colton's orbit. He had also thought, and continued to think, that something about the story Patricia had presented felt constructed in a way, could not quite name but could not quite dismiss either. He did not say anything to Colton immediately. Colton, in the first year after Jessica left, was not a man who could receive information that complicated his narrative. He was a man held together by the story he had told himself about what had happened, and removing a piece of that story without something to replace it felt too frank, like pulling a load-bearing wall from a building that was already fragile. So, Frank waited. He waited, and he watched, and he took quiet note of the things that did not quite fit. The way Patricia had seemed, in hindsight, almost prepared for the evening, everything fell apart. The way the photographs had appeared with a neatness that real discoveries rarely had. The way the report had no agency name on it, no professional letterhead, no verification chain, details that Frank, who reviewed documents professionally, had clocked in the moment he glimpsed it but had not pressed because it had not been his place. In the second year, Oliver learned to walk. He did it at 16 months, later than some babies, and exactly on time by every measure that actually mattered. He walked from the coffee table to Aunt Ruthie in 4 determined steps, and then sat down abruptly on the floor and looked at everyone as if to say that was intentional and he was done for now. Ruthie cried. Jessica got it on video and watched it 17 times that evening. He began talking in full sentences. Before his 2nd birthday, he had opinions. They were many and specific. He felt strongly about certain crackers and opposed other crackers on principle. He believed mornings were for singing, not for quiet, and he implemented this policy without consultation. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead no matter how many times Jessica smoothed it back, a strong jaw for a toddler. and a way of tilting his head slightly when he was concentrating on something that made Brenda, when she came to visit, go very still, and then change the subject quickly. Jessica noticed Brenda go still. She did not ask why. She already knew. Oliver looked like his father. She had known it since the first week, when she had studied his sleeping face in the dark of the rocking chair and seen the shape of someone she had tried to stop seeing. She did not tell Oliver about his father yet, because Oliver was 2, and the truth that was available to a 2-year-old was limited. She told him that his father was not with them, but that he was loved completely, and that love did not require a full house to be real. Oliver accepted this with the openness of a child who has not yet learned to question the reliability of the people who love him. He nodded seriously and went back to his crackers. Jessica moved out of Aunt Ruthie's house when Oliver was 2.5. A first-floor apartment 4 blocks away, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen with a window over the sink, a yard patch barely big enough for a blanket, but enough for a toddler and a ball. She signed the lease with her own name and her own income, and stood in the empty kitchen the first afternoon and put her hands flat on the counter and felt the particular satisfaction of a surface that belonged to her. She had built this. From the sidewalk outside Colton's building with a bag in her hand and nothing confirmed except her own resolve, she had built this. The job, the apartment, the life, the boy with the strong opinions about crackers and the hair that would not stay flat. Colton did not know any of it. He was 13 years old in his penthouse with his mother's redecorated office where the nursery had been, closing deals in cities he flew to and back from without ever really arriving, living the life of a man who had decided that the wall was the face and had forgotten there was ever a difference. But in the second year, on a Tuesday evening when he was alone in his office reviewing a contract that did not need reviewing, he opened his desk drawer looking for a pen and found instead a photograph. It had slipped between 2 file folders. A photograph from the early months of the marriage. He and Jessica at the harbor, a Sunday afternoon. Someone had taken it without them noticing. She was looking at the water and he was looking at her with an expression on his face that he did not recognize as his own at first, because it was so unguarded. It was the face of a man who had forgotten to be careful. He sat with the photograph for a long time without moving, then he put it face down in the drawer and went back to the contract and did not allow the feeling that had risen in his chest to complete itself. But it had started. The kind of thing that once started does not unstart simply because you close a drawer. Frank Holloway called him the following week. He said he wanted to have dinner, just the 2 of them, no agenda. Colton agreed. They went to a quiet restaurant on the waterfront. The kind of place with good lighting and tables far enough apart for a private conversation. Frank ordered carefully and then said, without preamble, because Frank was not a preamble person, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear it before you answer," Colton said. "Go ahead," Frank said. "Did you ever verify that report?" "The one about Jessica. Did you ever independently verify any of it?" The table went very quiet, Colton said. "I saw the photographs," Frank said. "I know. Did you verify them?" Colton said nothing, Frank said, "because I've been thinking about that document for 2 years, Colton. I looked at it for 30 seconds at dinner that night, and it had no agency letterhead, no investigator registration number, no verification signature. I know what professional investigative reports look like. That was not one." Colton set down his fork, Frank said. "I am not telling you what happened. I am telling you that you may not know what happened, and that there is a difference." The rest of dinner passed in a conversation that Colton could not fully track because his mind had gone to a place it had been refusing to go for 2 years, and now that it was there, it could not find its footing. He went home that night and did not sleep, and in the morning he called a private investigation firm whose name Frank had written on a napkin and placed beside his plate without comment. The investigation took 3 weeks. The report that came back was thorough, professional, documented, and it dismantled every element of Patricia's folder with the quiet efficiency of truth encountering fiction inadequate light. The photographs were confirmed to have been taken by an unregistered phone from a neighboring building. The man in the photographs was identified as a rideshare driver. The building in the background was confirmed to be 2 blocks from the obstetrics clinic, where Jessica had her prenatal appointments. Appointments that Colton himself had attended twice, and whose schedule he had known and somehow, catastrophically failed to recognize. Colton sat in his office with the report on his desk and the drawer containing Jessica's harbor photograph slightly open beside him, and he did not move for a very long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his mother. Patricia answered warmly. She always answered warmly. He said, "I need you to come to the penthouse tonight. There is something we need to discuss." She arrived at 7 in her cream blazer. She sat in the living room with her ankles crossed and her hands folded and her face arranged in the expression of a concerned and loving mother. Colton placed the investigation report on the coffee table in front of her and sat across from her and looked at her without speaking. She looked at the report. She looked at the first page. Her face made a series of small adjustments, each one a calculation. And Colton watched all of them and understood each one. Because he had grown up watching that face make those adjustments, and he had spent 40 years interpreting them as love. He said, "Tell me it is not true." She said nothing. He said her name slowly, the way you say a name when you are not asking a question but closing a door. And in the silence that followed, with her hands still folded and her ankles still crossed, and the cream blazer still pristine, Patricia Reeves told him with her silence everything he needed to know. He said, "I had a son." His voice was flat. Not because he was not feeling anything, because he was feeling everything at once, and the everything was too large for his voice to carry without collapsing completely. He said Jessica was telling the truth that night. "She stood in this room and told me the truth, and I pointed at the door." Patricia began to speak. He raised one hand and she stopped. He said, "I do not want an explanation tonight. I want you to understand that whatever you were protecting, whatever you told yourself this was for, you took my son from me. You took 3 years from a child who deserved a father, and you took them from a woman who deserved to be believed." He stood up. He said, "I think you should go." Colton stood alone in the living room after the door closed and felt the full structural collapse of everything he had used to hold himself together for 3 years arrive all at once. He walked to the window. He looked at the city. He thought about a woman in a white apron at table 7 who had looked at him without calculating anything. He thought about a child he had never seen whose name he did not yet know. Then he went to find Frank Holloway, because Frank was the only person he trusted to help him figure out what came next and how to do it without making everything worse than he had already made it. Outside in the Savannah evening, 4 hours south, Jessica Carter was reading Oliver his bedtime story. He was 2.5 and deeply opinionated about which story and in what order. And tonight he had selected a book about a small bear who gets lost in the woods and finds his way home by following the stars. Oliver knew most of the words already and said them along with her, slightly ahead of her reading pace, which he felt was too slow. She turned the last page and he exhaled with satisfaction and said, "Again," she said, "tomorrow." He considered this. Then he lay back on his pillow with the resigned acceptance of a small person who has negotiated and lost and is choosing dignity. She tucked the blanket around him and kissed his forehead and turned off the lamp. In the dark doorway, she paused and looked at him for a moment, his dark hair against the pillow, his small chest rising and falling with the peaceful certainty of a child who has never once doubted that he was loved. She whispered, "You are my whole world." Oliver Carter, he was already asleep. Frank Holloway was the kind of man who thought before he spoke and meant what he said when he finally said it, which was why Colton trusted him above everyone else in his life. They sat in Frank's home office the night Patricia left. 2 men at a small round table with coffee going cold between them. And Frank listened to everything Colton said without interrupting once. When Colton finished, Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what you have to do," Colton said. "I know," Frank said. "And you know it is going to be the hardest thing you have ever done," Colton said. "I know that too," Frank said. "Then we start tomorrow." "Not tonight. Tonight, you sit with what you know and you let it be real. You do not plan your way out of feeling it. You just feel it. Colton looked at him. Frank said, "You have been planning your way out of feeling things since you were 9 years old. It has not been working. Try something different tonight." Colton went home and did exactly that. He sat in the living room without turning on the television, without opening his laptop, without making a single phone call. He sat in the chair by the window where the city lights spread out below him like a map of everything he had built, and he let himself feel what 3 years of work in walls had been constructed specifically to prevent him from feeling, he thought. About the night he had said those words to Jessica, the way she had stood completely still with her hand on her stomach, the way she had looked at him after, not with hatred, but with something that was in many ways worse than hatred. The specific grief of a person watching someone they love choose to be wrong. He thought about a child born into a world where the father had already decided to be absent before the birth happened. He thought about what that child looked like, whether they had his eyes, whether they laughed easily or seriously. Whether they were afraid of anything, he did not sleep that night, but it was a different kind of not sleeping, and the kind he had been doing for 3 years. It was the not sleeping of a man who was finally awake, instead of the not sleeping of a man running from his own mind in the dark. In the morning he called Dr. Sylvia Monroe, a therapist Frank had been quietly recommending for 8 months. With the patience of a man who knew the recommendation would land when the person was ready, and not a moment before. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a building on King Street, with tall windows and bookshelves that went all the way to the ceiling. She was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain, and the kind of calm that did not feel performed, because it clearly was not. She said in their first session, "Tell me why you are here," he said. "I threw my pregnant wife out of our home based on evidence I never verified because part of me wanted to believe it was true." She did not react with visible surprise. She said, "Why did part of you want to believe it?" He said, "Because if she betrayed me, then I was right about people. If she was good, then I was wrong about everything, and I had destroyed something real," she said, "and which was easier to live with." He said, "I thought wrong about people was easier." "I was wrong about that too." She nodded and said, "Good. That is an honest place to start." He went back every week. He did not miss a single session. He did not treat it like a corporate obligation to be optimized and completed. He treated it like the work it actually was, difficult and slow and necessary. The kind of work that did not produce visible results for a long time, and then, one day produced results all at once, and you understood that the results had been growing the entire time. Underground, he hired the same investigative firm to find Jessica. He told them her name and her last known city, Charleston, and asked them to find her current location with care and discretion. No surveillance beyond what was needed for a current address. He told them explicitly that this was not adversarial, and that he did not want her frightened or followed, or watched in any way that would make her feel unsafe. The investigator, a woman named Patricia Cole, who had introduced herself with a slight smile at the coincidence of her first name, said she understood and she would be careful. The address came back 11 days later. Savannah, Georgia. A street name and a number and a notation that she was employed as catering coordinator at a company called Coastal Gatherings. There was also a name, Oliver Carter. Age 3, Colton read the name twice. He said it quietly in his empty office. Oliver, his son had a name, and the name was Oliver, and he was 3 years old, and even Colton had never heard it spoken aloud before this moment. He set the paper down and pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed carefully, because breathing carefully was the only thing available to him right then. He called. "Dr. Monroe," she answered between sessions, and he said, "I found them," she said. "How are you feeling?" He said, "Like I owe a debt I do not know how to begin paying," she said. "You begin by showing up honestly. Not with money, not with plans, not with the version of yourself you think she needs to see. You show up as the person who did the thing you did, and you let her decide what happens next. Can you do that?" He said, "I am going to try." She said, "Colton, trying is not enough this time. You have to actually do it." He drove to Savannah on a Saturday morning in September. He did not call ahead. He had considered it many times, had written 3 different messages and deleted all of them because every version of a text message felt like a way of preparing. Jessica for his arrival so that she could prepare her response, which was a way of making her emotional labor easier for him, and he had done enough of that already.